The morning the turkeys arrived was a Tuesday in late March, 1988. I remember the sky was the color of old tin, and the air had that damp, cold weight to it that promises a slow spring. The frost was still on the north side of the barn when the flatbed rumbled up the lane. A long-haul driver from somewhere in southern Missouri that looked like he'd been driving for 3 days straight. He had my birds, 25 of them. Giant bronze turkeys, the old standard breed, but these were something else entirely. They were the heaviest line the breeder had, and he was retiring, selling off his stock for pennies on the dollar. I'd paid $87 for the lot, plus another $100 for the shipping. $187 for 25 birds that stood nearly 4 feet tall and weighed, the driver assured me, close to 40 pounds apiece. They shifted in their crates on the truck bed, a low collective rumble of discontent, their heads like wrinkled blue stones, watching me with an unnerving prehistoric stillness. The driver just shook his head as we unloaded them into the holding pen I'd set up. "Mister," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black with grease, "I've hauled every kind of livestock there is. I ain't never hauled anything looks more like a dinosaur than them things." He took his money, didn't even stay for a cup of coffee, and was gone in a cloud of diesel smoke, leaving me alone with the quiet judgment of 25 oversized birds. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence that fell after the truck was gone, just the wind rattling the bare branches of the oak trees and the low, questioning gurgle from the turkeys. My target was the South 40. It wasn't really 40 acres, more like 36 and a half, and it was the piece of ground my father had always called his greatest disappointment. It lay low and flat, a shallow bowl that collected water from the 2 slight rises on either side. It never drained right. In the spring, it was a sheet of standing water until mid-May, and after a summer rain, it would hold a puddle for a week. The soil was a heavy, lifeless clay. We tried to graze it, but the cattle would just punch it up into a mess of mud and hummocks. For the last 10 years, it had been nothing but cattails and sedge grass, a red-winged blackbird sanctuary that cost me taxes every year. That's where the turkeys were going. My neighbor, Miller, drove by about an hour later. He wasn't a bad man, just certain. He farmed 1,000 acres of corn and beans, and he did it well. His equipment was always new, his fields were clean, and his truck, a shiny blue Ford F250, never had so much as a speck of mud on it. He pulled up to the fence line, rolled down his power window with a soft whir, and just looked. He looked at the turkeys in the pen, then at the expanse of brown, wet ground on the South 40. He didn't get out of the truck. "Morning," he said. I said it back. He nodded toward the birds. "Those are some big turkeys." "They are that," I said. He chewed on that for a minute, his gaze sweeping over the soggy field again. "What are you doing with 25 carnival birds on 40 acres of swamp?" The question was polite, but the meaning was clear. He thought I'd finally lost my mind. I'd been hearing versions of that question for a week, ever since I'd mentioned it down at the co-op. The young fellow there, fresh out of the state university with a degree in agronomy, had pulled up my soil maps on his computer screen. It pointed to the block of grey that marked the South 40. "That's a clay pan soil," it said, like he was the first person to ever discover it. "Got a percolation rate of less than a quarter inch an hour. The only real fix is systematic tile drainage. You'd need about 8,000 feet of 4-inch perforated pipe laid on 40-foot centers. Machine rental, pipe, labor. You're looking at maybe $20,000. And even then, it's no guarantee on a soil that tight." It printed out the data for me, a sheet full of numbers and charts that proved, in black and white, that the ground was useless. I'd folded it up and put it in my pocket. I told Miller the same thing I told the young man at the co-op. "I'm farming." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You can't farm that. You can't even walk on it most of the year. You gonna teach them turkeys to swim?" I just smiled. "They're heavier than they look." He shook his head slowly, a little sadly, like a doctor giving bad news. Well, it's your money. He rolled up his window and drove on, the clean tires of his Ford leaving precise tracks on the gravel. I knew what would happen next. By noon, the diner in town would have a version of the story, and by evening, the version would have grown. I was the old fool with the swamp pasture and the giant turkeys, trying to make something out of nothing. I didn't blame them. From where they stood, with their soil charts and their balance sheets and their clean trucks, they were right. But I didn't know yet what the turkeys knew. Or maybe I was just starting to remember something I'd been told a long time ago. My father used to say, "The land will tell you its secrets, but it whispers. You have to be quiet to hear it." And for the first time in a long time, I was trying to be quiet. I'll own that my reasons weren't entirely based on some mystical connection to the ground. They were rooted in memory and in a particular kind of logic that doesn't show up on a soil map. My grandfather, who farmed this same land with horses and pure stubbornness, never saw the South 40 as a problem. He called it the turkey bottom. He said that in the old days, before the big woods were cleared, the wild turkeys would winter there by the hundreds. He told me they'd work that ground all winter long, scratching for acorns and insects, turning the soil with their feet. He said they kept it from sealing over. A turkey's foot, he told me once when I was a boy, holding up his own gnarled hand, is a plow and a harrow all in one. They don't turn the world upside down like a mold board, they just stir it. They let the air in. After he passed, my father took over. He was a man of his time, the post-war generation that believed in bigger tractors, more fertilizer, and modern efficiency. He saw the South 40 not as a living system, but as a drainage problem to be solved. He tried to plow it one wet spring in the late 50s and nearly lost his new tractor. After that, he gave up on it, wrote it off as a loss, and it sat fallow and forgotten, slowly getting wetter and tighter with each passing year. The wild turkeys were long gone, and we had forgotten what they did. I hadn't thought about my grandfather's words in 30 years, but when the opportunity to buy those big bronze birds came up, something clicked. They weren't just livestock. They were a tool. A living, scratching, 4-foot-tall tool with a purpose. That was my theory anyway. A quiet, half-formed idea based on an old man's story. It wasn't enough to spend $20,000 on, but it was enough to spend a couple hundred. The night after Miller's visit, I couldn't sleep. I went out to the old milk house, the one we hadn't used for dairy since the 60s. It was my workshop now, a place of quiet and dust, smelling of old oil and damp concrete. On a high shelf, covered in a half-inch of grime, was a stack of my father's old farm ledgers. I brought one down. It was a standard marbled composition book, its corners gone soft and rounded with time. The cover was cool and smooth under my fingers. I took it back to the house and sat at the kitchen table under the single bare bulb. The rest of the house dark and silent. I opened it. My father's handwriting was a careful, deliberate cursive, every number in its own neat column. The pages were a history of our farm in miniature. 1962, 50 acres corn, 140 bushels per acre, sold for $1.12 per bushel. 1967, replaced clutch on the John Deere, $214. 1973, driest July since 36, lost half the bean crop. A page through the years, a slow procession of weather and yields, triumphs and failures, all recorded in the same steady hand. It was the voice of a man who paid attention. I put the notebook back on the shelf. I did this for 3 nights. I'd pick it up, feel the weight of it, and then set it aside. I want to be honest about my reasons. I was afraid of what I would find or what I wouldn't. I was afraid that I had invented that memory of my grandfather, that my grand theory was just sentiment. If there was nothing in my father's methodical records to back it up, then I was just the fool Miller and the kid at the co-op thought I was. On the fourth night, I finally made myself look. I turned to the back of the ledger from 1958, the year after he tried to plough the South 40. There, he'd drawn a rough map of the farm, sketching out the fields with a pencil. Each field was labelled. The South 40 was just marked low pasture. But in the margin, next to the drawing of that field, he had written a series of notes in a script that was tighter, more questioning than his usual confident hand. Water stands 4 to 6 inches after 2-inch rain. Soil probe hits hard pan at 8 to 10 inches. No response to lime. And then, at the bottom, a single line underlined twice. Grandpa called it turkey bottom, said they kept it open. And right next to that, almost an afterthought, 2 words and a question mark that changed everything for me. He had written, clay seal. That was it. That was the whisper. It wasn't a statement of fact. It was a question he had asked himself 30 years ago and never answered. He hadn't seen it as a permanent geological feature of the landscape, like the university kid with his computer maps. He had seen it as a condition, a seal, something that forms, and maybe, just maybe, something that could be broken. He had the same thought I did, but he didn't have the tool. He had a tractor that was too heavy and a plough that was too aggressive. He didn't have the turkeys. I closed the book. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. I wasn't working on a fool's errand. I was picking up a question my father had set down 30 years before. The land hadn't changed, but the way of looking at it had. The modern way was to see it as a problem of engineering, to be solved with diesel and plastic pipe. The old way, the way my grandfather knew and my father had almost remembered, was to see it as a problem of biology. I went to the window and looked out into the darkness, toward the South 40. It was just a black, empty space under the stars. But it didn't feel like a wasteland anymore. It felt like a puzzle, and I finally felt like I was holding the right key. The next morning I was out before 5. The air was cold and still. I had a roll of electric poultry netting, a solar fencer, and a dozen fiberglass step-in posts. My plan was methodical. I wasn't just going to turn the birds loose and hope for the best. I was going to run an experiment, a slow, patient conversation with the land. I paced off a section in the very lowest part of the field, the place where the water stood the longest. I measured out a square, 150 feet by 150 feet, just over half an acre. I drove the posts into the soft ground and strung the netting. It sagged in the middle, but it would do. By the time the sun was up, I had a pen. I brought the turkeys down from the holding area near the barn. They came out of the trailer cautiously, their big heads swiveling, taking in the wide, wet world I'd offered them. For the first hour, they just stood there, clustered together, making their low, guttural sounds. They were suspicious. Then one of them, a big Tom with a deep red wattle, took a tentative step onto the soggy turf. He sank an inch. He shifted his weight. Then he did something that made the hair on my arms stand up. He lifted one of his massive 3-toed feet and gave a short, powerful scratch. A clump of dead sedge-grass and dark earth flew backwards. He peered at the spot he'd cleared, then scratched again. Within 10 minutes, all 25 of them were at it. It wasn't the gentle pecking of a chicken. This was work. They were heavy birds, and they put their weight into it. Their feet, scaled and tough as leather, were like little rototillers. They scratched, and they walked, and they scratched again, a constant rhythmic stirring of the top few inches of the earth. I spent most of that first day just watching them. The sound was incredible, a constant shuffling, tearing sound, punctuated by the soft thud of their feet hitting the ground. They weren't just looking for food. They seemed driven by an instinct to dig, to expose, to aerate. They were ploughing. Not deep, not like a machine, but a shallow, persistent cultivation that was already changing the look of the ground inside the pen. I started keeping a new notebook, my own ledger for the South 40. Every evening, I'd go out and make my notes. Day 1. Birds covering approximately 30% of enclosed area. Surface vegetation being shredded and mixed with topsoil. Day 3. First rain since introduction. Water pooling outside the pen. Inside, the scratched surface appears to be absorbing moisture more readily. I bought a soil probe, a simple T-handled steel rod, 3 feet long. Every Sunday morning, I would take my measurements. I'd walk a grid inside the pen, pushing the probe into the earth every 20 feet. I recorded the depth at which I met serious resistance. Then I'd do the same on the untouched ground just outside the fence. The first week, the numbers were nearly identical. The probe would slide through the first few inches of wet topsoil and then stop dead at 8 inches, hitting that hard pan with a jarring thud. It was like hitting concrete. I could put my full weight on the handle and it wouldn't go any deeper. This was the clay seal my father had written about. For 2 weeks, the numbers didn't change. Miller drove by a few more times, slowing down but not stopping. I could feel his certainty from 100 yards away. The turkeys kept working. The half-acre inside the pen was starting to look like a freshly tilled garden, dark and crumbly. The smell was changing too. The untouched parts of the field had a sour, stagnant smell, the smell of anaerobic decay. Inside the pen, the earth smelled alive, rich and loamy. It was the smell of air getting into the soil. Then, on the third Sunday, something happened. I was on my grid inside the pen. I pushed the probe into the ground. It went past 8 inches. It went past 10. It slid down to 12 inches before the resistance started to build. I moved to the next point on the grid, 14 inches, the next 13. It wasn't everywhere, but it was happening. The hard pan, that dense layer of compacted clay that water couldn't penetrate, was being fractured from above. It wasn't the turkeys scratching that was doing it directly. They were only stirring the top few inches. But by breaking up that surface layer, by mixing in the organic matter of the dead grasses, they were allowing the water to soak in rather than run off or evaporate. The soil was rehydrating, and as the clay below the hard pan absorbed that moisture, it was swelling and shrinking, creating its own cracks and fissures. The turkeys were just the catalyst. They were unlocking a natural process that had been dormant for decades. I went over to the untouched ground and tried the probe. Thud. 8 inches. I went back inside the pen. 14 inches. I didn't cheer. I didn't run to the phone to tell anyone. I just stood there in the quiet of a Sunday morning, with the probe in my hand and the smell of damp earth in the air, and I felt a profound sense of rightness. The land was starting to talk back, and for the first time, I was beginning to understand its language. It was a slow language, spoken in inches and textures, but it was telling me that my grandfather had been right. The work continued through the spring and into the summer. Every 2 weeks, I'd take down the electric netting and move the pen. I laid out the whole 36 acres in my mind like a grid, a checkerboard of half-acre plots. My goal was to have the birds cover the entire field by the first hard frost. It was a slow, deliberate rotation. Behind them, they left a patch of ground that was completely transformed. The dense mat of sedge and cattail roots was gone, shredded and mixed into the soil. The ground was darker, looser, and pocked with the marks of their scratching. It looked rough, but it was alive. I had a significant setback in early July. A big summer thunderstorm rolled in from the west, the kind that drops 3 inches of rain in 2 hours. I watched it from the porch, and my heart sank. I was sure the whole South 40 would be a lake, that all the progress would be washed away. The next morning I went out expecting the worst. The untouched parts of the field were just as I'd feared, covered in a sheet of glassy water. But the sections where the turkeys had already been were different. There were puddles, yes, but they were smaller, and the ground between them was merely saturated, not flooded.
You could see the waterline, a perfect demarcation between the worked and unworked ground. The land the turkeys had prepared was already starting to breathe. It was draining.
I stood at the edge of one of the treated plots and pushed my boot into the soil. It was soft, but it held my weight. 10 feet away, on the fallow ground, the same step would have sunk me to my ankle in grey, sticky mud. This was the proof I needed, a private vindication that no one else saw. The diner could have its stories, Miller could have his doubts. The land itself was telling me I was on the right path. The turkeys, for their part, were thriving. They were magnificent birds, growing bigger and heavier by the week. They were foragers by nature, and the wet ground was a buffet for them. They devoured insects, worms, and the roots of the tough grasses. I supplemented their diet with a standard grain mix, but half of what they ate they harvested themselves. Their constant activity, their very presence, was the engine of the whole operation. They were fertilizing as they went, their high nitrogen manure being worked directly into the soil by their feet.
They were the ploughs, the harrows, and the fertilizer spreaders, all in one. The cost was minimal. The initial price of the birds, the $100 for the solar fencer and netting, and about $300 in grain over the course of the season. Less than $500 for a process the university kid had quoted at $20,000. Of course, it was slower. A fleet of tiling machines could have done the work in a week. My 25 birds were taking all summer. But my father had another saying I thought about a lot during those months. You can't farm what you've already spent. The modern approach was to spend the money first, to go into debt on the promise of a future return. It was a gamble. My way was slower, but it was paid for. Every inch of progress was real, earned, and owned outright. I kept my notebook meticulously. I recorded the rainfall, the dates I moved the pen, the changing depths on the soil probe. The numbers told the story. By the end of August, in the sections they'd worked back in April, my probe was going down 24, sometimes 30 inches. The hard pan wasn't just fractured, it was disappearing. The structure of the subsoil was changing, becoming granular instead of plated. I took a few soil samples and laid them out on the tailgate of my truck to dry. The sample from the untreated area dried into a hard grey brick cracked on the surface like a dry creek bed. The sample from the turkey-worked ground crumbled in my hand, a rich, dark aggregate that smelled sweet. I knew then that it would grow corn. I was learning to see the farm not just as a collection of fields to be worked, but as a series of interconnected systems. The turkeys weren't just a novelty. They were a part of the system, a biological solution to a biological problem. The conventional wisdom was to fight the land, to impose your will on it with steel and diesel. But there was another way.
A way that involved listening and patience, and trusting the instinct of a creature that had been managing soil for 1,000,000 years before the first plough was ever invented. As the fall approached, the birds were enormous, sleek and powerful. They'd done their job. The entire 36 acres had been scratched, stirred and fertilised. The ground lay ready, a dark, crumbly expanse waiting for spring. I had made my bet and the land had responded. But the final judgment would have to wait for the harvest. In late October, I decided it was time for an outside opinion, not from a skeptic like Miller, but from someone who knew soil, someone without a preconceived notion of what was and wasn't possible on that piece of ground. I called the State University's Extension Service, but I didn't ask for the young fellow at the co-op. I asked for the head of the Soil Science Department, a man named Dr. Albright. I was told he was mostly retired, only did field consultations on special request. I explained what I had done, simply and without exaggeration. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I expected a polite dismissal. Instead, he just said, "Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock. He arrived in an old university station wagon, a vehicle that had clearly seen its share of muddy field roads. He was a small, wiry man in his late 60s, with a deeply tanned face and hands that looked as worn and capable as my own. He wasn't carrying a clipboard or a laptop. He had a simple soil probe, much like mine, and a canvas bag with a few sample jars. He was the quiet, validating expert, though I didn't know it at the time. I met him at the gate to the South 40. I didn't give him a long speech, I just handed him my notebook, the one I'd been keeping all summer. "This is what I did," I said, "and this is what I measured." He took the notebook and sat on the tailgate of his station wagon, paging through it slowly. He didn't say a word.
He just read my columns of dates and rainfall totals and probe depths. He looked at my clumsy sketches mapping the rotation of the turkey pen. He spent a good 20 minutes with my records before he finally closed the book and handed it back to me. "All right," he said, "let's walk." We started on the edge of the field, on a small patch near the road that I had intentionally left untouched as a control plot. He didn't need to ask. He knelt, picking up a clump of the soil. It was damp and heavy in his hand. He pushed his own probe into the ground. It went in easily for a few inches, then stopped with a dull thud. He grunted, put his shoulder into it, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled it out. The tip was coated in a smear of slick grey clay. 8 inches, he said. It wasn't a question. I just nodded. We then walked 50 yards into the field to the first plot the turkeys had worked back in April. The difference was visible even to the naked eye.
The ground here was darker, the texture more like coffee grounds than pottery clay. A few winter weeds were already sprouting. He knelt again, this time letting the soil run through his fingers. He pushed his probe into the ground. There was no thud. The steel rod slid down, a smooth, steady pressure. It went past his knees, past his waist. He pushed it all the way to the handle, a full 36 inches into the earth, without hitting a significant barrier. He pulled it out and examined the length of the rod. It came up clean, showing a cross-section of dark, structured soil for the first 2 feet, gradually lightening in color but remaining friable. He didn't say anything. He just wiped the probe on the leg of his trousers and walked to another spot, 100 feet away. He repeated the process. The probe sank again. He went quiet. There was a silence that was different from Miller's skeptical silence. Miller's silence was the closing of a door. This was the silence of a man re-evaluating everything he thought he knew.
He spent the next hour walking my field, a slow, methodical grid of his own, pushing the probe into the earth every 50 feet or so. I just followed, a few paces behind, letting him work. He was reading the story of the soil, a story my turkeys had rewritten. Finally, he stopped in the middle of the field and turned to me. He looked at the ground, then at the sky, then back at me. I was prepared for a lecture, for him to tell me this was a temporary anomaly, that the hard pan would reform as soon as the ground settled. Instead, he just shook his head, a look of quiet wonder on his face. "In all my years," he said, his voice low, "I've seen people try to break up a plough pan with subsoilers, with deep rippers, with tons of gypsum. Heavy, expensive, fossil fuel burning work. I've never seen it done like this." He paused, looking down at the dark soil at his feet. "You haven't just fractured the pan, you've changed the structure, the organic matter, the aeration, the biological activity. You've rebuilt the topsoil. This is substantial." That was the word he used, substantial. It wasn't amazing or incredible. It was a plain, solid, deeply satisfying word from a man who did not waste them. He took a few samples in his jars, labelled them carefully, and we walked back to his car. "You plant this to corn next spring," he said, "and you be ready for a surprise." He thanked me for my time, got in his old station wagon, and drove away, leaving me alone in the field once more.
The wind was picking up, carrying the cold promise of winter. I looked out over the 36 acres of dark, resting earth. The turkeys were gone.
I'd sold them the week before to a specialty processor in the city who paid a premium for pasture-raised heritage birds. The check had more than covered my entire investment, leaving me with a small profit. But the real return was under my feet. Dr. Albright's one quiet word was all the validation I needed. The rest would be up to the corn. That winter was long and cold, with a good snow cover that protected the soil. When spring finally broke, the South 40 was the first field on my farm to be dry enough to work. I remember the day I finally put a tractor on it. I didn't use my big four-wheel drive. I used my father's old Alice Chalmers, a smaller, lighter machine that wouldn't compact the newly living soil. The feeling was extraordinary. For my entire life, that field had been a hard, unforgiving place to work.
The tractor would fight the ground, the plough shearing off great sticky plates of clay that refused to break apart. But this time it was different. The discs sank into the earth, turning up a rich black loam that crumbled behind the machine. It smelled sweet, the way good soil should. There was no fight. The ground welcomed the steel. It felt like a partnership. I planted a standard corn hybrid, nothing special, with a light application of starter fertilizer. I was conservative. I didn't want to push it too hard the first year. The rains came, gentle and steady, just when they were needed, and the corn grew. It came out of the ground strong and even, a carpet of bright green shoots across the whole field. There were no yellow drowned-out spots, no bare patches where the water had stood too long. For the first time in my memory, the South 40 was a uniform, thriving field. By July, it was shoulder high. By August, it was well over my head, the stalks thick and sturdy, the ears filling out. It was keeping pace with my best ground, the fields that had never been a problem. I'd walk out there in the evenings, the way a farmer does, just to look. I'd stand at the edge and listen to the sound of the wind rustling through the millions of leaves, a sound like running water. It was the sound of a healthy crop. It was the sound of life where there had been stagnation. The vindication wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, steady accumulation of evidence over the course of a growing season. It was in the colour of the leaves, the size of the ears, the way the ground held moisture after a rain without becoming waterlogged. The final proof, as it always does, came with the harvest. In mid-October, I brought the combine in. It was a clear, crisp autumn day. The corn stood dry and ready, 10 feet tall. I climbed into the cab, took a deep breath, and engaged the header. The machine roared to life, and the first golden kernels of corn began to flow into the grain tank. I watched the yield monitor on the console, a little digital screen that measured the bushels per acre in real time. On my other fields, my good ground, I'd averaged about 160 bushels that year. It was a decent, if not spectacular, year. As the combine moved into the South 40, the number on the monitor began to climb. 170. 175. It settled in and held steady, flickering between 183 and 187. I stopped the machine in the middle of the field and just stared at the number. 185 bushels to the acre. On the worst piece of ground I owned. On land that had been written off as useless, that the experts had told me would take a $20,000 investment just to make it marginal. I harvested the whole field. The grain trucks filled up faster than I'd expected. The final tally was just over 6,500 bushels of corn from 36 acres of reclaimed land. Land reclaimed by 25 turkeys and a season of patient work. The numbers were undeniable, printed on the scale tickets from the elevator. They were quiet, irrefutable, and deeply satisfying. It wasn't about being right and proving everyone else wrong. It was about the quiet joy of seeing something broken made whole again. It was about listening to a whisper from the past and finding it to be true. The land had been waiting. It just needed the right kind of partner, one with feathers and a good scratching instinct. The profit from that corn crop after expenses, was substantial. But the real profit was the 36 acres of productive soil I now had, a permanent asset added back to the farm. It was a profit that would pay dividends for the rest of my life, and for whoever came after me. The day I finished harvesting the South 40, Miller drove by. It was late afternoon, and the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the corn stubble.
He was in his clean blue Ford, as always. He pulled over to the side of the road, right where he had stopped that first day to question my sanity. This time, he got out of the truck. I was on the combine, making my last pass along the fence line. I saw him standing there, his arms crossed, watching. I finished the row, swung the machine around and shut it down. The sudden silence was vast, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. I climbed down from the cab. We stood on opposite sides of the fence for a moment. He looked out over the harvested field, at the neat rows of stubble and the dark, turned earth. He looked at the grain truck, filled to the brim with corn. He kicked at a clump of dirt with the toe of his immaculate boot. "Corn looks good," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. "Did all right," I said. He nodded, his eyes still scanning the field. He was a good farmer. He could read a field as well as I could. He could see the evenness of the stand from the stubble, could estimate the yield just by looking. He knew what he was seeing was not supposed to be possible. He looked back at the ground beneath his feet, the place where water used to stand for weeks. "Doesn't look as wet out here as it used to," he said. That was it. That was the whole conversation. It was as close to a concession as a man like him would ever get, and it was more than enough. He didn't ask how I did it. He didn't ask about the turkeys. He had seen the result, and that was all that mattered. He gave a final brief nod, got back in his truck, and drove away. That quiet, understated acknowledgement was the real trophy. It wasn't a moment of triumph, of rubbing his nose in it. It was a moment of shared understanding between two men who worked the land. A quiet recognition that something remarkable had happened. I stood there by the fence for a long time after he was gone, watching the sun go down.
I thought about my father's notebook, about that single questioning phrase, clay seal. It wasn't just a geological query, it was an inheritance. It was a piece of unfinished business, a thread of curiosity passed down from one generation to the next. My father had suspected the truth, but his tools and his time had led him to a different conclusion. He had the right question, but the wrong method. The modern experts, with all their data, had the wrong question altogether. They saw a problem of plumbing, of moving water away with pipes. They never asked what had made the ground seal up in the first place. They never considered that the solution might not be to add something expensive, but to bring back something that was missing. My grandfather knew. He didn't have the science or the terminology, but he knew. He understood the land as a community, a system where every part had a role. The turkeys weren't just birds, they were custodians of the soil's health. When they left, the system broke. All I did was bring them back. It occurs to me now that sometimes the best tool for the job isn't a new machine with a bigger engine. Sometimes the best tool for the job has a heartbeat. It works slower, sure, but it works with the grain of nature, not against it. It heals as it works, patience and attention. That's what it took. The patience to work on the land's schedule, not mine, and the attention to listen to the whispers, to notice the small changes, to read the story the soil was trying to tell. The land doesn't care who believes in it. It responds to the right action, whether it's performed by a $20,000 machine or a flock of 40-pound birds. If you've got your own piece of stubborn ground, your own turkey bottom, that everyone else has written off, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. There's a lot of wisdom in those forgotten places. Subscribe if this meant something to you. There are more stories here. Stories about listening to the old ways and trusting the slow, patient ground.